Thank you both for really sort of enlightening remarks. I want to try to sort of provide my own sort of unifying sort of comment. I think on the one hand, Professor Schleicher has shown that notwithstanding the structural incentives that Professor Gerken has proposed to sort of reap the benefits of uncooperative federalism, we may still not get all of the benefits that are to be obtained. I think Professor Young has sort of outlined 4 areas where we might not only fashion additional sort of structural incentives, but sort of has introduced this idea of the constitutional and structural tensions that uncooperative federalism and for that matter, the robust dissent may cause. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm hoping that for people who live in a state that is as big a fan of uncooperative federalism as Oklahoma, that someone might have an idea, a comment, or a question. Mr. Kern?
Yeah, my question came up under Professor Schleicher's talk. Thank you very much. That was really a lot of fun. One of your ideas had to do with changing an election law that allowed people to identify with one party for federal elections and another party at the state level. And in your article in The Atlantic this summer, where you kind of expanded on some of these ideas, you talked about how people oftentimes know comparatively less about local elections than national elections, and so the national party becomes kind of a heuristic for making local decisions. If we actually made this kind of a decision, so you could identify as Democrat at national and Republican at local, do you think people would take advantage of that, or sort of functionally would there be no distinction because they're still leaning on national identification for local decisions?
So the answer is I have no clue.
Yeah.
You do see, so I don't want to say it, I have absolutely no clue, but I largely have no, I mean, you're asking a question of if a reform education, what would the world look like? And we do see differentiated local political identities to some degree. And so we might imagine that we see kind of certain types of local brands being created, that they would be effective. And so, for instance, a number of cities had things called slating commissions, which were local quasi-parties that existed for a period of time. They didn't have access to the ballot, and they were unfortunate in a number of other respects, but they did exist for periods of time, and so that you do see the development of local-only brands. There are, in other countries who have very different election law systems, so it's kind of hard to make comparison, development of local-only brands where the identities are completely different. So in Vancouver and in Montreal, you have completely different parties, or almost completely different parties, at the national, regional, and local levels, such that the party identities, and people do change identities across levels of government. The entities are completely separate, such that the 3 big parties in Vancouver elections don't have national names. They're the Nonpartisan Alliance, and then the Bicycle Green Goody Messenger Bag Party, or whatever it's called. But they're so that you do see differentiated local party entities, people having more than one. F. Scott Fitzgerald once said, the sign of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold 2 completely contradictory ideas and still function. The question you're asking is, to what extent do Americans have first-rate minds? And you can answer you can answer that question yourself. So,
thank you very much,
Professor Levin.
Yeah, as a political scientist, I share both of these papers. But I do find myself wondering, insofar as I still have a residual identity as a law professor, what does law have to do with your analyses? Because, I mean, the brunt really of Ernie's presentation is that law sets up a baseline for negotiation. But we shouldn't confuse law with anything that's particularly obligatory, so that there's no reason to, at least for you, to criticize Rick Perry or a Democratic governor for saying, this is a stupid law, you force me to obey it. This is uncooperative federalism. This is dissenting by deciding. We can ratchet up one level to the Constitution, and it's even more mysterious what role constitutional federalism plays, unless you really applaud vigorously the Supreme Court getting back into the game and, applying something called constitutional federalism. But I don't view that as part of Professor Gerken's analysis. I mean, it seems to me that her analysis is a very, very interesting political analysis of all the ways that decentralization operates in the American political system. And I think it's, really extremely insightful. But I really do wonder what role law does play or should play in our discussion of the extent to which we either want to empower local institutions or smash them because their dissenting values are really dreadful.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds to me like you're limiting the role that law would play to the ultimate constraints on what Congress potentially could do, for instance. I just don't think that's the
Or a
only
local school board.
The only question, though, I think, for instance, there's a terribly interesting legal question about the institutional design of federal regulatory schemes. So what sort of roles should new federal regulatory schemes assign to state officials? And what prerogatives should it leave to those state officials? How much discretion should it grant them? How ready should we be to grant waivers for state departures? What should the remedies be when state officials don't do exactly what the federal regulators do? And I think that's a legal question, right? I think the question about the wellsprings of state-based dissent. So how do you design state executive branches in a way to promote, uncooperative federalism? If you thought this was really the ballgame about federalism, then maybe you would want more state bureaucrats, especially the ones that are tasked with implementing federal law, to be elected, for instance, to be directly accountable to the voters so that they would really have in mind the possibly distinctive values that those people gave them. So I think in a lot of ways, I mean, the over-cooperative federalism question is a preemption question. I mean, what does it take to have preemptive federal law? I mean, should the executive's position on how much enforcement we want, should that be preemptive or not? How often should we, I think there's an even more fundamental question in preemption doctrine, which is when federal law regulates up to a particular level, should we read that as simply setting a floor beyond which the states can go, or should we read that as a balancing of interests, for instance, environmental safety versus cost, so that a departure in either direction is going to be preempted under the Supremacy Clause? That leaves a lot less room for over-cooperative federalism if you do it that way. So these are all legal questions.
Mine's not legal. I want to say Heather did it first, so it's her fault.
No, Daryl should go. I've got a rebuttal, and I've got lots of jokes about Ernie for the rebuttal.
I don't know whether you want to do it now or not. First of all, I'd like to put another issue on the table that, especially in a place like Oklahoma, is in fact there are three sovereigns, right, in the United States, and we ought not forget that, right? And we ought to, when you're looking at boundaries, right, and jurisdictional boundaries, especially, it's a really critical question that involves both international law, federal constitutional law, and state law. Second, there's a current experiment going on right now in California, right, in the primaries, right, and so the top two. So in fact, we ought to step back and say, wait a minute, let's see whether this institutional change, right, produces the kind of differentiation that exists. And there was, I mean, I lived for 10 years in a state where there wasn't a Republican Party or a Democratic Party, right? It was called Minnesota, right? There was the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, and there was the Independent Republican Party, right? And as the funding of the parties driven by national election changed, those parties then changed to mirror the national parties and drove out some of the local distinctiveness. And as a fellow Texan, right, we know that the experiment with institutional structure of state government is profound, right? I mean, the governor may be able to say a lot,
right,
but he
can't
do
anything, which is why we don't mind him so much. People don't understand. He's funny.
So I've got two quick things. One is that the California experiment, for its worth, most of the existing research has suggested that the change in the top two priority actually hasn't had much effect yet. that most elections have ended up, almost like 99% of elections have ended up looking like exactly like they did before, for reasons that you could probably figure out. I think it's interesting, and we'll see. Yes, there's all sorts of experiments. We are doing things. There are local identities. The question is just relative to some, I suppose, mythical optimal level. Where are we? And I was suggesting that perhaps we've got reasons to believe that, although things change over time, and you're absolutely right, that we saw much more differentiated local parties. And so we actually, historically, had very, very different. So Larry Kramer's name comes up, and he talks about differentiated state parties. The thing that his story, I think, generally misses is that there was a lot, he puts the moment of change roughly in the 1950s or 1970s, whereas actually, if you look at kind of the variables we might consider for differentiation in local parties, do they share the same name? Do they, to what degree are institutional structures similar? We saw an enormous amount of change roughly in 1896, starting in 1876 and then in 1896, where we see the parties' kind of local identities getting eaten away very quickly. So that the deviation in local party brands before 1876 and really before the Civil War was extreme. The parties were largely coalitions of state parties, and after 1876 you see a major drilling down of party name, and after 1896 you see, after the big realignment, you see a major change in organizational structure, and then even more recently you saw ticket splitting as recently in the 1970s as a major force. People are claiming the death of political parties. Ticket splitting is now largely an accident. It's a leftover phenomenon. That's maybe an exaggeration, but actually is an exaggeration. But you see much less of it than you once did. But one quick thing I want to say about that we bring up, Rick Perry brings up, is that there's now been revealed that a bunch of Yale political scientists were central to Rick Perry's re-election campaign, engaging experiments, Gerber and Green, the kind of leading experts on turnout. So I think that Yale University has an unknown connection, now that we know that Heather helped write Rick Perry's book, to the Rick Perry campaign. So I wonder if they should be responsible for oops.
So I think it's a partial answer to Sandy's question as well, that you don't have to interpret federal constitutional law to stifle those kinds of experiments. That's a choice that the government made, and maybe it suggests that they should have chosen otherwise in some of those speech cases that wiped out political experimentation. But that's a legal question. The only thing I'd say about Native Americans is I think it may, other than I don't know anything about Native American law, is that it may illustrate Heather's point about how being entirely outside the game, even if you're acknowledged as sovereign in some sense, is just death, right? I mean, they're not important players in federal politics, and if to the extent that the states are going to remain relevant, they may have to, be important players, and they may want to be important players in federal politics.
One follow-up. Since the state compacting process has worked in the natural resources area, right? To what extent is it just too cumbersome a process to think about regional federalism?
You're gonna make him crazy too.
No. It's a really hard question. So the basic, we have a lot of theories that even where you don't have to get Congress's authority, that interlocal contracts between governments turn out to be really difficult to enforce. So Clay Gillette has a kind of notable series of papers on how difficult it is to enforce local contracts, because it would require a judge to come in and say, actually, New York City, you're spending your budget wrong in contract with this continent, and it's very difficult to enforce these things. And so we do see state compacts particularly in transportation is another probably other big area. The Port Authority is our kind of largest budget-wise state compact, and you could imagine that kind of thing. I think that it's unlikely to be a major part of our political life ever, but it could be wrong.
No.
Professor Stone? Yeah, so this sort of a question about David's thing is, as you know, I think there might well be some merit to the idea of having separate local party identities, but there's a trade-off. One is obviously if you multiply a number of parties, voters have to keep track of, given what you said about the limited attention they pay to politics in general, that sort of multiplies their knowledge burden. Second, I do actually seem to remember an important, brilliant scholar who in one of his first articles pointed out that the notion that local politics is really non-ideological is probably wrong. There's a lot of local political conflicts are sort of rehashing at the local level of broader ideological national conflicts like the role of government versus markets, social conservatism versus social liberalism,
he means
and so
me,
forth.
I think. Ilya, to the first point, you're absolutely right. It's a conflict, though I might add that it's much of it's a problem for me. It's a problem for Heather, in the sense that the idea here that what you're suggesting is that there's a limit on our ability to develop differential political ideas at different levels of government, and that the brands would help to some degree, but they'd also hurt, and that to the extent that we don't think people are capable of doing that, we should not imagine they engage in too much dissenting by deciding or on cooperative policymaking. The second point is right and wrong. What I argued was a little different than that. He says that there were ideological disputes at the local level, but they didn't necessarily correlate particularly strongly with national political debates. So I believe that there are ideological debates about zoning or about methods of policing or methods of teaching, like phonics or whole language, that are basically the same as in terms of that people disagree about them and they could be the subject of partisan debates, but we don't actually see national party differences. And so a great example of this, although apparently there's an election in a year for something called the presidency, the really important election happening in 2013 for mayor of New York City. And one thing that you can say is there's literally no consistency across the Democratic Party candidates who everyone thinks are on any relevant local issue. So the people, they disagree, and they disagree widely, but if you took any important local issue, you took the last 20 major decisions made by the Bloomberg administration, you could not find one issue on which all Democrats agree. That's a sign of a breakdown of local parties, but it's not necessarily a sign that there couldn't be local parties. You could imagine agreement, and there are agreements across people in local politics. So I agree and I disagree, or I agree and I definitely agree with the brilliant part, though. So I'll have to give you credit for that. So.
Anybody else? Probably have time for one more. Mr. Torres, you want to? All right. Well, thank you both very much.